January the 31st, 2020 will have a special place in the histories of both Britain and Europe. 3.5 years after the UK voted to leave the European Union, at 2300 GMT this evening, the UK will formally leave. 47 years of EU membership will come to an end. It promises to be a day of symbolism. In Brussels, Brexit Party MEPs walked out of the European Parliament building holding the Union flag and with a bagpiper leading the way. Tonight, the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is due to make an address to the nation in which he will hail the dawn of a new era. Helen Catt has more.
We've had Brexit dates set before, but as the Union flag's flying in central London and the specially minted 50p coins now in circulation suggest, today really is the day that the UK will leave the EU after 47 years. Whether you love Brexit, loathe it, or are somewhere in between, it's a significant moment.
Make no mistake, it is a massive day. And it's a massive day because as of 11 o'clock here, 12 o'clock in Brussels, we don't get to stop Brexit. It's done. We're not a member state. We cannot rejoin without going through a very complicated process, and at the end of the year, if transition ends then, real practical effects will kick in.
In Brussels, British MEPs have already packed up. Their jobs will no longer exist. But we're unlikely to notice much change overnight. The UK will keep following EU rules until the end of December as the government negotiates a new trade deal with Europe. Negotiations are likely to begin almost immediately, and the government wants them done by the end of the year. A date the EU has signed up to as well.
We're talking about security and defence and the movement of people, and then the centrepiece will definitely be this big trade deal. So it's a massive undertaking, and it's also very different from a normal trade deal because usually we're trying to build, bridges and trying to come together and find an equal ground, but in this case we're diverging to some degree.
From tonight, the UK will also be free to negotiate its own deals with other countries, and Parliament will soon start the process of deciding on what should go in the new laws that will be drawn up to replace EU ones. MPs will be busy though. They'll need to pass a lot of legislation in time for next January. Helen Catt, BBC News, Westminster.
Now, speaking in Brussels a short time ago, the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said the most important thing after Brexit is to remain united.
There was a very precious experience made by the 27 of the European Union. This is the experience how much unity counts, how strong we are in unity, way more than by 27. It's way more than each single country would ever have on its own. And we made the experience how strong we are in defending our values, our interests, but also protecting our member state, Ireland. And therefore, this experience of being together and solving problems together was a valuable one. Even if, as I say, we regret the decision of the British people, but we respect it. And now we open another chapter.
Ursula von der Leyen there, the President of the EU Commission. Now, we can also bring you some thoughts today on this Brexit day from the Irish Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar.
I'm ambitious about the future EU-UK relationship. But I also think we need to be realistic about the dangers. We need to start this new relationship between the EU and the UK on a firm and honest footing. And that means a level playing field. This is very much in Ireland's interests, as well as that of the Union as a whole.
That was the Taoiseach, the Irish Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar. Well, let us cross now live to a former senior EU official, a former commissioner, and indeed former Finnish Prime Minister, Jyrki Katainen. Mr. Katainen, thanks for joining us. We've heard a lot of people in Brussels talking about their regret, their sadness. Are you filled with regret, or are you already looking forward to what happens next in the EU?
Well, to be honest, both. I do regret. It's a pity that UK has decided to go, because UK has been a very valuable partner for all those member states who have been interested in trade policy or developing single market. But of course, we have to look at the future. If thinking positively, I would expect that security and defense cooperation will remain one of the focus area in the cooperation between the UK and EU. And this is a very important matter for both. But then a big question is how well or how good our trade relationship will be. Because the main issue for the UK is to decide whether they want to stay in the internal market, meaning that they would accept level playing field, as Taoiseach Varadkar just said, meaning joint regulation, joint rules, and joint safety standards on various issues like environment or health or product safety policies.
But Mr. Katainen, sorry to interrupt you, but it's clear that Boris Johnson's government has no intention of accepting the so-called level playing field and close alignment. He's made that very clear. So is the EU then going to play hardball and actually not offer the UK a preferential trade deal of any sort?
Well, stakes are very high in both sides. Both British companies and people and EU citizens and companies want to have as harmonious relationship as possible. But if you are not part of the internal market, then it can never be as good and harmonious as it is today. So I guess both sides want to negotiate some sort of trade agreement, but it can never be as good and enable as smooth cooperation as being part of the internal market.
Ursula von der Leyen, the chief of the Commission, was emphasising the need for unity amongst the 27 post-Brexit. But isn't the reality that the EU has been seriously weakened, will be weakened by the departure of the United Kingdom?
Well, UK's role, of course, as a large member state has been very, very important. But what we have seen happening in the EU amongst the 27 member states since the referendum in UK, it has strengthened our unity. And I must admit that I have been to some extent surprised how unified our policies has been when we have negotiated with our UK partners on Brexit deal. So this is also a time for the rest of the EU to decide which direction to go, what are the policies we want to concentrate on, and how our future will look like.
All right, Mr. Katainen, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, very little will change in the short run. It is important to remember that, because there's going to be an 11-month Brexit transition period. But there will be pressure on both sides, as we've just discussed, to get a trade deal by the end of 2020. Now, the UK Cabinet Minister Michael Gove, a long-time supporter of Brexit, is confident that any agreement will be, his words, as frictionless as possible.
It's only the beginning, actually, of a new chapter in Britain's history. There are lots of opportunities for us outside the European Union. There are commercial and economic opportunities, but it's also the case that it's a chance for us as a country to come together, to recognise that many of the people who voted to leave, many of the areas that voted strongly to leave, felt that they had been overlooked and undervalued, and now it's time to bring our country together.
Michael Gove there. Well, as I've said, just hours now to go until the formal Brexit departure. Our political correspondent Rob Watson told me that there wasn't really a mood of obvious triumphalism in Downing Street.
No, there isn't, and for this reason, and there's an interesting parallel really with 1973, January, when we joined. There wasn't much triumphalism then, I think partly as a result of uncertainty. That's also the case now. There's uncertainty about what comes next. But I think there's a lack of triumphalism and celebration in part as well because of these divisions of the last 3.5 years. I mean, Downing Street know how raw, how sore those divisions are. And they're also fully aware of the challenge ahead, Stephen, because as you said, Boris Johnson ran on this slogan of Brexit, get Brexit done, but he didn't say get done for what? He didn't spell out what it was going to mean. Was Britain going to have a new economic model, a brand new trade and foreign policy? All of these challenges lie ahead, and Brexit has gone from being the sort of abstract to now being real, and Mr. Johnson will have no place to hide.
Indeed, and I think the Irish Prime Minister has said, you know what, this is just half time in the meaningful Brexit negotiations, and by that he means that, as you've just said, all of the detail of what a future relationship might look like is still to be decided. How tough do you think Boris Johnson is going to be in those negotiations? Is he hanging tough and going to play political hardball, do you think?
So far he is, and of course he is very much emboldened on the one hand by having a very large majority in Parliament, 80, and of having handsomely won a general election, and having the opposition parties and pro-European forces in this country in some disarray. But set against that, the negatives for Boris Johnson, and that is that most businesses, half the population, most diplomats, historians, and most of the UK's allies still think of Brexit as a mistake of historic and costly economic proportions. And of course the EU thinks that they're going to have the upper hand in these negotiations. Why? Because their market is bigger than ours, and they also think Mr Johnson has made the same mistake of Mrs May of setting a deadline, setting the clock running to the end of this year to get this new relationship, this negotiation worked out, which they think very much favours them, that they are somewhat less desperate than the UK.
Rob Watson there in Westminster.